Emma never imagined that a simple doctor's visit would change her life forever. Yukon reserved, she dreaded meeting her gynecologist until she walked into the office and found him. He, Dr. Adrian Black, young, brilliant, and secretly a millionaire. But beneath his charm lay a mystery that would entangle them both in irresistible passion and danger. The unexpected encounter Emma Carter had always been different from the rest. While other girls her age were out enjoying life, dating, and posting glamorous moments on social media, she found solace in the quiet corners of the library, where she worked part-time. Books were her escape, her silent companions in a world where she often felt invisible. But today was different. Today, she wasn't hiding behind a book. Today, she sat on a cold, hard chair in a clinic's waiting room, clutching the strap of her purse so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Her heart pounded. She hated hospitals. She hated doctors. And most of all, she hated the thought of discussing something as personal as her health with a stranger. But she had no choice. Her body had been giving her warning signs: mild pain, discomfort, and irregular cycles that she could no longer ignore. "You're overthinking again," came a familiar voice beside her. Emma turned to her best friend Lily, who was sitting next to her, scrolling through her phone as if this were just another ordinary day. Unlike Emma, Lily was confident, outspoken, and never afraid of anything. "I don't think I can do this," Emma murmured, her stomach twisting with anxiety. Lily sighed, putting her phone away. "Emma, it's just a doctor, a gynecologist, not an executioner." Emma's face burned at the word. Gynecologist. It felt so personal, so invasive. She wrapped her arms around herself, her shoulders hunching. I've never been to one before. What if it's awkward? What if he asks weird questions?" Lily gave her an exasperated look. "Emma, it's their job. They see hundreds of patients a week. They don't care if you're shy or awkward. They're professionals." Emma swallowed hard, but her anxiety didn't ease. She had always been shy, socially awkward to a fault. The idea of opening up about something so private made her want to run out of the clinic and never look back. She wished she hadn't agreed to this, but Lily had practically dragged her here, insisting it was important to take care of herself. And deep down, Emma knew she was right. A nurse stepped into the waiting room, holding a clipboard. Emma Carter. Emma's breath hitched. This was it, the moment she had been dreading. Lily gave her an encouraging nudge. "Go on, it'll be fine." Emma forced herself to stand. Her legs felt wobbly as she followed the nurse down the hall. The soft scent of antiseptic filled her nostrils as they passed several closed doors, each leading to a different consultation room. Finally, the nurse stopped in front of one and smiled. "Dr. Blackwood will see you now." Emma nodded, her throat too tight to form words. She took a deep breath and stepped inside. And then, she froze. Dr. Adrian Blackwood. The doctor was nothing like she had expected. Sitting behind a sleek wooden desk was not the middle-aged, serious-faced man she had imagined. Instead, a tall, strikingly handsome young man in his early 30s looked up at her. His dark brown hair was neatly styled, his sharp jawline perfectly sculpted, and his piercing blue eyes held an intensity that made her stomach flip. His white coat fit him perfectly, emphasizing his broad shoulders and lean frame. But what truly stunned her was the confidence he radiated, not arrogance, but an effortless authority that made it impossible to look away. For a moment, Emma forgot how to breathe. "Miss Carter." His deep voice was smooth, patient. Emma's face burned. She suddenly realized she had been standing awkwardly at the doorway, staring like an idiot. Yes," she stammered. A small, amused smile played at the corner of his lips. "Please, have a seat." Emma hesitated before finally moving forward, sitting on the plush leather chair in front of his desk. Her hands trembled as she placed them in her lap. "I'm Dr. Adrian Blackwood," he introduced himself, leaning slightly forward, his gaze focused entirely on her. "How are you feeling today?" Terrified, mortified, completely out of her depth. But she couldn't say that. I'm fine," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Dr. Blackwood studied her for a moment, his gaze soft but observant. "You seem a little nervous." Emma swallowed hard. "I've never been to a gynecologist before." Something flickered in his eyes. Understanding. Instead of dismissing her nerves, he nodded thoughtfully. "That's completely normal. Many first-time patients feel that way." His voice was calm, reassuring, not mocking, not impatient, just understanding. Emma exhaled slowly. "Maybe this wouldn't be so bad. Before we begin, I want you to know that this is a safe space," Adrian said gently. "You can ask me anything, and there's no rush. My goal is to make you feel as comfortable as possible." His words had a strange effect on her, a warmth spreading through her chest, easing the tightness in her throat. She had expected this to be the most uncomfortable experience of her life. But there was something about Dr. Blackwood, something that made her feel safe. She had no idea why, but she felt like she could trust him. Little did she know, this was only the beginning. Emma's heart pounded as she sat across from Dr. Adrian Blackwood, her fingers nervously intertwined in her lap. His presence was overwhelming, not just because he was impossibly handsome, but because he exuded a quiet confidence that made it difficult to look away. He wasn't like any doctor she had imagined, stern, cold, and distant. Instead, there was something deeply personal in the way he looked at her, something that made her feel like she wasn't just another patient on his schedule. Why did he feel so familiar? Adrian smiled, sensing her hesitation. "Would you like a glass of water before we begin?" Emma hesitated before nodding. "Yes, please." He stood, walking over to a sleek mini fridge in the corner of the office. The way he moved, effortless, graceful, powerful, made something unfamiliar stir in Emma's chest. He handed her the glass, his fingers briefly brushing against hers. A shiver ran down her spine. What was that? She quickly took a sip, trying to focus. "All right," Adrian said, settling back into his chair. "First of all, I want to thank you for trusting me. I know this can be a difficult experience, especially for someone as shy as you." Emma's cheeks flushed. "How did you?" He chuckled softly. "You've barely looked at me since you walked in, and you keep fidgeting with your hands." Emma immediately dropped her hands into her lap, embarrassed. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable," Adrian added gently. "I just want you to know that it's okay to be nervous. It's completely normal." Something in his voice made Emma relax, even if just a little. She cleared her throat. "I've been experiencing some irregularities, and mild pain." Adrian nodded, listening intently. "I see. I'll need to ask you a few more questions to understand your symptoms better." "Nothing invasive, just a conversation." Emma nodded hesitantly. She was still nervous, but Adrian's calm presence made it easier. As he asked her questions, she found herself talking more than she expected. His tone was always patient, never rushed, and for the first time, she felt like someone was actually listening. But as they spoke, a strange feeling lingered in the back of her mind. There was something about him, something familiar. Then out of nowhere, he smiled at her in a way that made her heart skip a beat. "You don't remember me, do you?" Emma blinked. "What?" Adrian leaned back in his chair, studying her. "I thought you might not recognize me. It's been years, after all." Her breath hitched. "Years. Recognize him?" Panic flickered through her. "I don't understand." Adrian sighed, a soft chuckle escaping his lips. "High school, senior year. The girl who always sat in the corner of the library buried in books." Emma's eyes widened. A flood of memories crashed into her. No, it couldn't be. Her lips parted in shock as realization dawned. Adrian Blackwood." He nodded, a ghost of a smirk playing on his lips. "You do remember." Emma's heart was racing now, but for an entirely different reason. Adrian Blackwood, the boy from high school, the boy who had been the most popular, the most untouchable, and the most admired, and the boy who had once saved her from the worst humiliation of her life. Flashback, the past that haunts her. Emma had always been invisible in high school, too shy to speak up, too quiet to be noticed. But one fateful day had changed everything. It had been during lunch break, when some mean girls had cornered her near the lockers, mocking her for her oversized sweater, her lack of makeup, her complete disinterest in anything fashionable. "You seriously think you'll ever get a guy's attention looking like that?" one of them had sneered. "You're pathetic." Emma had frozen, her face burning in shame. She had never wanted anyone's attention, but the way they laughed at her, the way they treated her like she was less than nothing, had shattered something inside her. And then he had appeared. Adrian Blackwood, the school's golden boy, the one everyone wanted to date, the one who had every girl's heart at his feet. Except, instead of ignoring the scene like most popular guys would have, he had walked straight up to her bullies and said in a dangerously low voice, "You have 2 seconds to leave before I make sure you regret this." The girls had gone pale, before scurrying away. And then Adrian had turned to Emma, offering her his jacket. "Don't listen to them," he had said softly. "They don't know a thing about you." Emma had been too stunned to reply. The next day, Adrian had walked into the library, where she always hid, and had sat across from her. No words, no teasing, just quiet companionship. And that had become their secret. He would visit her sometimes, sit with her, and pretend to read while she lost herself in her books. And then one day, he had disappeared. She had never seen him again. Until now. The present, a millionaire's secret. Emma's breath came in quick, shallow gasps. "I don't understand. You just vanished." Adrian's gaze softened. "I had to leave town. My family went through some complications. I was forced to step up and take over my father's business." Emma's eyes widened. "Business?" Adrian exhaled. "I never wanted to follow in his footsteps, but fate had other plans. I became the CEO of Blackwood Enterprises." Blackwood Enterprises, the billion-dollar empire that everyone talked about. Emma felt like the ground had been pulled from under her. Adrian Blackwood was a millionaire. She shook her head in disbelief. "And now you're a doctor." He smiled. "I've always wanted to help people. Medicine was my true passion. So even though I run my family's business, I chose this path too." Emma couldn't process it. He wasn't just successful. He was in an entirely different league. "You look overwhelmed," Adrian murmured. Emma let out a nervous laugh. "That's an understatement." Adrian reached forward, gently placing his hand over hers. The touch sent electricity through her veins. "I'm still the same, Adrian you knew," he whispered. "The one who sat across from you in the library. The one who thought you were the most fascinating girl in the entire school." Emma's heart stopped. "The what?" His blue eyes darkened with something deep, something she couldn't name. "I was never just helping you, Emma. I was falling for you." Emma's breath hitched, and just like that, her world turned upside down. Emma's heart pounded so loudly, she could barely hear her own thoughts. Adrian's words echoed in her mind. "I was falling for you." She stared at him, her lips slightly parted in shock. "You what?" Adrian's gaze didn't waver. His blue eyes, filled with intensity, held hers in a silent confession. "I was falling for you back then, Emma," he repeated, his voice softer this time, but no less powerful. "But I was too much of a coward to tell you." Emma's fingers curled around the edge of her skirt, trying to steady herself. How was this happening? The Adrian Blackwood, the high school heartthrob, the billionaire, the doctor, had feelings for her. It felt impossible. She let out a nervous chuckle, shaking her head. "No, that can't be right. You had girls chasing after you. You could have been with anyone." Adrian leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, closing the space between them. "But I didn't want just anyone, Emma." Her breath hitched as he reached out, his fingers grazing hers. The touch sent a current of heat through her body. "You were different," he murmured. "You never tried to impress anyone. You were just you, and you had no idea how beautiful that was." Emma's pulse went wild. No one had ever said something like that to her before. She swallowed hard, her emotions warring with the voice in her head that kept telling her this was too good to be true. "But you left," she whispered. "You disappeared without a word." Adrian's jaw tensed. "I didn't want to leave. I fought to stay, but my father was sick, and I had no choice. I was thrown into a world I never wanted to be a part of. She saw the flicker of pain in his eyes, and her anger softened. I looked for you, he admitted, after I settled in, but you weren't anywhere to be found. Emma bit her lip. She had left town too, escaping to college in another state, trying to forget the painful memories of high school, the loneliness, the bullying, the feeling of being invisible. I guess we just lost each other, she said quietly. Adrian exhaled sharply. Maybe, but now I've found you again. His fingers finally closed over hers, his warmth seeping into her skin. Emma's breath caught. This was dangerous. Everything about him was dangerous. The way he looked at her, the way he made her heart race, the way he made her want to believe in something she had long given up on. Love. She pulled her hand back, standing up abruptly. This is crazy. Adrian stood too, his gaze darkening. Why? Because you, a billionaire, a doctor, and She stopped herself. What was she supposed to say? That she was just a shy girl still figuring out her place in the world. That she wasn't the kind of woman who belonged in his high-class glamorous life. Adrian stepped closer, his towering presence making her feel small yet intensely aware of him. Emma, do you think any of that matters to me? She swallowed, refusing to meet his gaze. He exhaled, frustration and something else, longing flashing in his eyes. I don't care about the money, the fame, the business, none of that has ever mattered. She finally looked at him, and her breath hitched at the raw emotion in his eyes. What does matter, Adrian? She asked softly. He took another step forward, so close now that she could feel the warmth radiating off him. You, he murmured. You have always mattered to me. The words struck her deep, piercing through the walls she had spent years building. And then he reached out, tucking a strand of her hair behind her ear. The touch was featherlight, but it sent a shiver down her spine. His fingers lingered for a moment before his hand cupped her cheek, his thumb tracing her skin. Emma felt like the world had stopped spinning. His gaze dropped to her lips, and she knew he was going to kiss her. Her mind screamed at her to step back, to run, to protect herself from whatever this was. But her heart wanted to stay. Adrian leaned in, his breath warm against her skin. Tell me to stop, he whispered, and I will. Emma's lips parted, but no words came out. She didn't want him to stop, and in that moment, she knew she was already falling for him. The air between them was thick with tension, an electric pull neither of them could ignore. Emma's pulse pounded in her ears as Adrian's fingers caressed her cheek, his eyes dark with desire. Tell me to stop, he had whispered, his breath warm against her lips. But Emma couldn't say the words. She couldn't stop this. She didn't want to stop this. Her lips trembled as she stood frozen in place, her heart warring between fear and longing. She had never been kissed before. Never had a man look at her the way Adrian was looking at her now, like she was the only thing that mattered. Adrian's thumb brushed her lower lip, sending a shiver down her spine. And then he kissed her, softly, gently, like he was afraid she might break. Emma gasped at the sensation, her hands gripping the fabric of his shirt, as his lips moved over hers, slow and tender, yet filled with a hunger she had never known. Adrian deepened the kiss, his arms wrapping around her waist, and pulling her flush against him. Emma melted into his warmth, her body trembling, as he held her like she was the most precious thing in the world. She had never been touched like this, never been wanted like this. Her fingers tangled in his hair, as she kissed him back, losing herself in the intoxicating feel of him, his scent, his warmth, his touch. But just as quickly as the moment consumed her, fear crept into her chest, wrapping around her like a vice. What was she doing? This was Adrian Blackwood, billionaire doctor, a man who could have any woman in the world. And she was just Emma, a shy, awkward girl who didn't belong in his world. Panic surged through her, and she tore herself away from him, her breathing ragged, Adrian's brows furrowed in concern. Emma, she shook her head, wrapping her arms around herself. This this is a mistake. Adrian's expression darkened. You don't mean that. She stepped back, her heart hammering against her ribs. I do. Her voice was shaky, but she forced herself to say the words. You and I, we're from two different worlds. This can't happen. Adrian took a step closer, but she backed away again. Emma, don't do this, he said softly. You felt it too. Don't pretend like this meant nothing. Her throat tightened. It doesn't matter what I felt. This isn't real. You're just caught up in nostalgia. I'm just an old high school memory to you. Adrian's jaw clenched. You really think that? His voice was raw, hurt flashing in his eyes. Emma forced herself to nod, even though it felt like her heart was shattering. She had spent her whole life being invisible, a girl no one noticed, no one cared about. She had built walls to protect herself, and she wasn't about to let Adrian, a man who belonged to a world she could never fit into, tear them down. I should go, she whispered, her eyes stinging with tears. She turned toward the door, but before she could leave, Adrian caught her wrist, his grip firm yet gentle. Emma, look at me. She hesitated, then slowly turned back, her eyes meeting his. His gaze burned with something fierce, something undeniable. I don't care where you come from. I don't care about the past. You are what matters to me, and I will fight for you, Emma. Her breath hitched, and for a moment she wanted to believe him. She wanted to let herself fall. But she was too scared, scared of getting hurt, scared of what would happen when reality caught up with them. So she pulled her hand away and walked out the door, leaving Adrian standing there, his expression filled with heartbreak. Emma walked out of Adrian's office, her hands trembling, her heart a chaotic storm inside her chest. She had kissed him, really kissed him, and it had felt like everything. Like the world had melted away, like she had been pulled into a place where nothing else mattered, except the warmth of his arms, the way his lips had claimed hers, with so much tenderness and passion. And yet she had run, because the emotions were too much, because she was too afraid. She hurried down the hallway, trying to steady her breathing, her vision blurred with unshed tears, as she fumbled for her purse. She needed to leave, but just as she reached the exit, a firm hand caught her wrist. Adrian, Emma, stop, he said, his voice low, intense. She closed her eyes, swallowing hard. Please, Adrian, just let me go. But he didn't. Instead, he gently turned her around, forcing her to meet his gaze. His blue eyes weren't angry. They weren't filled with frustration or disappointment. They were filled with something else entirely, something that made her chest ache. I can't let you go, he murmured. Emma's breath hitched. Why? Adrian exhaled, his thumb brushing over the inside of her wrist, sending shivers up her arm. Because I've waited too long for this moment. His voice was soft, but there was a fierceness beneath it. I lost you once, Emma. I won't let that happen again. Her throat tightened. You don't understand, she whispered. I'm not like the women in your world, Adrian. I don't belong there. He frowned. Who told you that? She let out a shaky breath, her insecurities threatening to spill out. It's the truth. Look at me. I'm just a shy, ordinary girl. You're a billionaire, a doctor, a man who could have anyone. Adrian's jaw clenched, his grip on her hand tightening. Emma, I don't want anyone. I want you. Tears stung her eyes. She wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to, but she had been invisible her whole life. No man had ever looked at her the way Adrian did. How could she trust that this wasn't just some fleeting infatuation? She tried to pull away, but Adrian wouldn't let her. Instead, he cupped her face, forcing her to truly see him. You think I don't understand what it's like to feel out of place, he said, his voice raw. You think growing up with wealth made my life perfect. I spent years trying to be someone I wasn't, Emma. I had expectations thrown at me that I never wanted. But you, his thumb brushed away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. You've always been real, and I fell for that. I fell for you. Her lips trembled. But what if I'm not enough? Adrian let out a breath, his forehead resting against hers. You are everything. Emma's heart slammed against her ribs. The way he looked at her, the way he held her, it was overwhelming, terrifying, and yet, it felt like home. Adrian tilted her chin up, his lips inches from hers. Let me prove it to you, he whispered. Let me love you, Emma. A single tear slipped down her cheek, and this time, she didn't run. Instead, she closed the distance, pressing her lips to his, surrendering to the fire that had been burning between them for so long. Adrian groaned softly, pulling her closer, deepening the kiss. His hands tangled in her hair, his touch both gentle and possessive, as if he had been starving for her. And for the first time in her life, Emma let herself be wanted. Emma had never felt this way before, like she was weightless, like the world had melted away, leaving just the two of them, in a space where nothing else mattered. Adrian's lips moved over hers, with a slow, aching tenderness, as if he was memorizing every second, every breath. His hands cupped her face, his warmth grounding her, even as her heart raced wildly. She was his, if only for this moment, and he was hers. When they finally pulled away, Emma's breath came in soft, uneven gasps. She could still taste him, still feel the way his fingers had traced her skin, as if she were something precious. Adrian rested his forehead against hers. You have no idea how long I've wanted this. Emma's lips parted, but before she could respond, a sharp knock at the door shattered the moment. They froze. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Adrian exhaled, his jaw clenching as he stepped back. Stay here, he murmured, brushing his fingers over hers, before turning toward the door. Emma swallowed hard, hugging herself as she watched him open it. And then her world tilted, because standing there, in an expensive dress and heels, was a woman who looked like she had walked straight out of a fashion magazine. Tall, beautiful, confident, and the way she was looking at Adrian made Emma's stomach twist. Adrian, the woman purred, stepping forward. It's been too long. Emma felt like she couldn't breathe. Adrian's expression darkened. Claire. Emma didn't know much about Adrian's past, but she had heard whispers, rumors about the woman who had once been engaged to him. The woman who had left him, just days before their wedding, his ex-fiancée. Emma's hands clenched into fists at her sides. What was she doing here? And why did it feel like the ground had just been ripped out from under her? Shadows of the past. Adrian didn't step aside to let Claire in, but she didn't seem to care. She smiled, a slow knowing smile, as she crossed her arms over her chest. You're not happy to see me, she teased. Adrian's voice was cold. What do you want, Claire? Claire sighed dramatically. Can't an old friend drop by to say hello? Then her gaze flickered past him, to Emma. For a long moment, Claire studied her. Emma felt small, under the weight of her stare, painfully aware of the way Claire's perfectly styled hair and designer clothes contrasted with her own simple dress and nervous posture. A flicker of amusement passed through Claire's eyes before she turned back to Adrian. So this is the reason you haven't returned any of my calls. Adrian's jaw tightened. I told you, we have nothing to talk about. Claire let out a soft chuckle. Oh, but we do, darling. You just don't know it yet. Emma felt a sharp pang in her chest at the way Claire said darling, like she had every right to, like she still had a claim on him. Adrian exhaled heavily. Say whatever you came here to say, Claire. Then leave. Claire smiled sweetly, but her eyes gleamed with something sharper. Fine, I'll be direct. She tilted her head. I want you back. Emma felt like she had been punched in the stomach. The words hung in the air, thick with meaning. Adrian's body went rigid. That's not happening. Claire raised an eyebrow. Are you sure? She took a step closer, lowering her voice. Because I remember a time when you loved me. A time when you would have done anything for me. Adrian's fists clenched at his sides. That time is over. Claire sighed, shaking her head. Oh, Adrian, you always were so stubborn. Then she smiled again, but this time, it was directed at Emma. You must be Emma, right? Her voice was smooth,
almost too friendly.
Emma swallowed hard, forcing herself to nod. Yes. Claire's gaze swept over her, and then she laughed softly, shaking her head. Wow, she said, turning back to Adrian. You really have changed. The words weren't a compliment, they were an insult. Like she couldn't believe Adrian had gone from her, a wealthy, sophisticated woman, to Emma. Emma's cheeks burned. Adrian's expression darkened. If you came here to insult her, you can leave now. Claire smirked. Oh, darling, I'm just surprised, that's all. Then she reached into her bag, pulling out a sleek envelope. But before I go, you might want to take a look at this. She handed it to him. Adrian hesitated before opening it, and as his eyes scanned the paper inside, his expression shifted from annoyance to shock. Emma's heart pounded. Adrian? Adrian didn't say anything for a long moment. Then slowly he looked up, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite read. Claire smiled. Now do you see why we need to talk? Emma's pulse pounded in her ears as she stared at Adrian, waiting, dreading his reaction. His eyes remained locked on the paper in his hands, his jaw tight, his expression unreadable. Claire, standing beside him with a self-satisfied smirk, crossed her arms. I told you, Adrian, you and I have unfinished business. Emma's hands clenched at her sides. What was in that letter? And why did it feel like her heart was seconds away from shattering? Adrian exhaled sharply, finally lifting his gaze. What kind of game are you playing, Claire? His voice was low, controlled, but Emma could hear the tension beneath it. Claire let out a soft chuckle. No game, darling, just the truth. She tilted her head, looking almost bored. Now, are we going to discuss this like adults, or are you going to keep pretending it doesn't matter? Adrian's grip on the paper tightened. Nothing about you matters to me anymore. Claire's smirk faltered, just slightly, but she quickly recovered. We'll see about that. She turned toward Emma then, her gaze sharp. And you, sweet girl, don't get too comfortable. Emma stiffened. Excuse me, Claire smiled. A slow, knowing smile. Adrian and I, we have history. And if you think he can just walk away from everything we shared, you're more naive than I thought. Emma's chest tightened. History. She didn't have that with Adrian. She had moments, stolen glances, lingering touches, a love that had blossomed unexpectedly. But Claire had years, a life that had once been intertwined with his, and suddenly, Emma felt small, like an outsider in his world. Adrian stepped forward, his voice sharp. Claire, that's enough. Claire sighed dramatically, flipping her hair over her shoulder. Fine, I'll go, for now. Then she leaned in close, whispering just loud enough for Emma to hear. But sweetheart, trust me, men like Adrian, they always go back to where they belong. With that she walked away, her heels clicking against the floor, leaving a silence so thick Emma could barely breathe. Adrian let out a slow breath, running a hand through his hair. Emma, but she took a step back. What was in that letter? Her voice was quiet, but inside, she was screaming. Adrian hesitated. That hesitation hurt. Finally, he handed her the paper. Her fingers trembled as she took it, her eyes scanning the elegant, expensive stationery. And then, her breath caught. A marriage contract between Adrian Blackwell and Claire Kensington, dated 5 years ago. Emma's heart twisted painfully. You were going to marry her? Adrian's jaw clenched. A long time ago. But why does she still have this? Emma's voice cracked. Adrian exhaled heavily. Because Claire's family had lawyers involved. Our parents, especially mine, pushed for the marriage because it was a perfect match in their eyes. Wealth, status, influence. It was never about love. Emma swallowed hard, but you still almost went through with it. Adrian's eyes darkened. Until I realized that I would rather be alone for the rest of my life than spend another second pretending with her. Emma's chest ached. So why does she want you back now? Adrian let out a humorless laugh. Because Claire doesn't like losing, and because, he sighed, rubbing the back of his neck, her father's company is in trouble. A merger with Blackwell Enterprises would save them. She thinks if she gets me back, she gets everything. Emma shook her head. She's using you. Adrian nodded. She always has. Emma should have felt relieved. But all she could think about was Claire's parting words. Men like Adrian always go back to where they belong. And the worst part, Emma wasn't sure if she was where he truly belonged. A heart at war. The next few days were torture. Emma tried to act normal, tried to focus on work, but her mind was a mess of insecurity and doubt. Adrian called, texted, but she didn't know what to say, because deep down she was afraid. Afraid that no matter how much Adrian claimed he had moved on, Claire still had a piece of him. Afraid that someone like her, a shy, ordinary girl, could never compete with someone like Claire. And so, when Adrian finally showed up at her apartment, knocking on her door like he wasn't willing to let her go, she almost didn't answer, almost. But then she did, and the moment she saw him, his blue eyes filled with frustration, worry, love, her walls began to crack. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. Emma, talk to me. She swallowed hard. Adrian, I love you. His voice was raw, desperate. I don't care about Claire. I don't care about the past. I care about us. Emma's eyes filled with tears. But what if I'm not enough? Adrian stepped closer, cupping her face. You are everything to me. Her breath hitched. Adrian, please, he whispered, pressing his forehead against hers. Don't let her win. Don't let her make you doubt us. Emma closed her eyes. She wanted to believe him. And when Adrian kissed her, slow and deep, pouring all of his love into her, she knew he was telling the truth. But Claire wasn't done yet, and the biggest test of their love was still to come. Emma clutched her phone, staring at the screen as another message from Claire appeared. Claire, did Adrian tell you everything, or is he still keeping secrets? Her fingers trembled as she scrolled up, rereading the last few messages Claire had sent her. Claire, men like Adrian don't change, sweetheart. Claire, when he kissed you, did you wonder if he was thinking of me? Claire, come meet me, just once. I'll tell you the truth, he won't. Emma knew she should ignore it. She should block her and trust Adrian. But the seed of doubt had already been planted, and now it was growing, fast. She hesitated, then typed out a message. Emma, where? A response came instantly. Claire, Black Velvet Cafe. 1 hour. Emma let out a shaky breath. She didn't know what she was expecting, but something told her this meeting could change everything. A dangerous conversation. The cafe was elegant, dimly lit with warm golden lights. Emma spotted Claire immediately, seated at a corner table, sipping a glass of red wine, like she had all the time in the world. Emma hesitated, then forced herself to move forward. Claire smirked as she approached. Ah, the little mouse finally arrives. Emma sat down stiffly. What do you want? Claire tilted her head. I'm just looking out for you, darling. Emma clenched her fists under the table. Cut the act. If you have something to say, say it. Claire's smile widened. Fine. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. Did Adrian tell you that I'm pregnant? The words slammed into Emma like a wrecking ball. No, no, that couldn't be true. She shook her head. You're lying. Claire's expression was smooth, unreadable. Am I? Emma felt the air being sucked out of her lungs. Adrian hadn't told her. Why? Her voice came out weak. It's not his. Claire let out a soft, mocking laugh. Oh, sweet girl, are you sure about that? Emma's pulse roared in her ears. No, this wasn't happening. Claire lifted her wine glass, swirling the liquid inside. You think he can love you more than me? You think you'll ever replace me? She sighed dramatically. Adrian and I, we have too much history. We share too much. Emma could barely think. Was Claire telling the truth? And if she was, could she survive it? A love on the brink. Emma didn't go home that night. Instead, she wandered the city streets, the cold air biting at her skin. She wanted to believe Adrian. She wanted to trust the love he had given her. But Claire's words kept echoing in her head. I'm pregnant. By the time she finally returned to her apartment, it was nearly midnight, and Adrian was there, waiting. The moment she stepped inside, his face filled with relief, then concern. Emma, where have you been? I was worried sick. She swallowed hard, avoiding his gaze.
I met Claire. A muscle in his jaw tightened. Emma, she said she's pregnant. Her voice wavered. Is it yours? Silence. It stretched between them, suffocating. Emma felt her heart breaking. Then Adrian exhaled sharply. No. Emma looked up, searching his face. Are you sure? His eyes burned with frustration. Emma, I haven't touched Claire in years. Whatever game she's playing, she's trying to drive a wedge between us. Emma wanted to believe him, but Claire had been so confident, so sure, and Adrian had kept things from her before. She shook her head. Then why didn't you tell me? Adrian ran a hand through his hair, his voice filled with exasperation. Because I didn't want her lies to get inside your head. I didn't want you doubting what we have. Emma bit her lip. But I am doubting it, Adrian. His expression cracked, pain flashing across his face. Emma. He stepped closer, reaching for her hands. Please, don't let her win. Her throat tightened. I don't know what to believe anymore. Adrian's grip on her hands tightened slightly, his voice desperate. Believe me, believe us. She wanted to, but doubt was a poison, and it was already spreading. A love on the edge. That night Emma didn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with what-ifs. What if Claire wasn't lying? What if Adrian still had feelings for her? What if she was just a temporary part of his life, doomed to be replaced? By morning she had made a decision. She needed space. Adrian arrived at her apartment, just as she was packing a small bag. His expression darkened. What are you doing? Emma took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. I just need time to think. Adrian's eyes filled with fear. Emma, I love you, Adrian. Her voice cracked. But I need to figure out if I can survive in your world, if I can trust you completely. Adrian shook his head, stepping closer. Don't do this. Tears burned her eyes. I have to. She turned away, but before she could take another step, Adrian grabbed her wrist, gently, but firmly. Emma, his voice was raw, broken. Please don't walk away from me. She turned, looking into the eyes of the man she loved more than anything. And for the first time, she didn't know if love was enough. Emma sat by the window of a small inn, miles away from the city, staring out at the endless stretch of trees, swaying in the cold wind. The past few days had been unbearable. She had thought distance would help her clear her mind, but all it did was make her realize how deeply she loved Adrian. Yet, love alone wasn't enough. She needed trust, she needed certainty, and right now, she had neither. Her phone vibrated on the bedside table. She already knew who it was. Adrian. She hesitated, then picked it up. Adrian. Emma, please come home. Just talk to me. Adrian. I'm going crazy without you. Her heart clenched. He had sent dozens of messages, each one filled with raw desperation, and she had ignored them all. Until now, with a deep breath, she finally typed a reply. Emma, I need more time. But before she could hit send, another message popped up. Unknown number. You think leaving will change anything? Emma's stomach dropped. Then another message. Unknown number. Adrian is mine. He always has been. Come back, or watch how I destroy him. She gripped the phone, her breath coming fast. Claire. Emma's hands trembled as she read the words again. This wasn't just jealousy, this was a threat. And suddenly being away didn't feel safe anymore. A desperate return. Emma arrived at Adrian's penthouse late that night. Her heart pounded as she stepped into the dimly lit living room. Adrian was standing by the window, his back to her, holding a glass of whiskey. The moment she closed the door, he turned and the look in his eyes shattered her. Raw pain, exhaustion, a deep, aching sadness. He had lost weight. His sharp cheekbones were even more defined, his hair a mess, his shirt wrinkled. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in days. Emma, his voice was hoarse, almost disbelieving. She swallowed hard. I got a message. His jaw tightened. From Claire. She nodded. She's threatening you. Adrian exhaled, running a hand through his hair. She's trying to manipulate you. But what if she's serious? Emma's voice shook. What if she really? Before she could finish, Adrian closed the distance between them, in 2 strides, and cupped her face in his hands. Emma, he whispered, his thumb brushing against her cheek. I don't care what she says. I don't care what she does. The only thing I care about is you. Tears filled her eyes. Then prove it, she whispered back. Tell me everything. Adrian's body tensed. A storm brewed in his dark eyes. Hesitation, fear, love, and then finally, surrender. He took a deep breath, and he told her everything. The truth that changed everything. Adrian had met Claire when he was young and reckless. She was beautiful, ambitious, manipulative. For years she had played with his emotions, dangling love in front of him, only to take it away. I was obsessed with her, Adrian admitted, his voice low. I thought I loved her, but I was addicted to the pain she gave me, not to her. Emma listened, her heart twisting. Then came the real truth. 2 years ago, she got pregnant, Adrian said, his voice hollow. She told me it was mine. I was ready to marry her, take responsibility. But then, his fists clenched. I found out it wasn't my child. Emma sucked in a breath. She had been lying. The baby belonged to another man, a man she was secretly engaged to. Emma covered her mouth, shocked. Adrian let out a bitter laugh. She wanted to trap me, but when I found out, I walked away. I swore I'd never let her manipulate me again. Emma stared at him, her heart breaking for the man who had suffered so much. And now Claire was back, trying to do the same thing again. Tears slipped down Emma's cheeks. Why didn't you tell me? She whispered. Adrian looked at her, his eyes filled with regret. Because I was afraid you'd leave me. His voice cracked. And you did. Emma let out a soft, broken sob. And then, without thinking, she threw her arms around him. Adrian froze for half a second. Then he crushed her against him. His lips found her hair, her forehead, her cheeks. Emma, he whispered, his voice desperate. Don't leave me again. She clung to him. I won't. For the first time in days, she felt whole again. All, but deep down, she knew Claire wasn't done yet. And this love was about to be tested in ways they never imagined. Emma woke up to the sound of her phone, vibrating on the nightstand. The early morning sun filtered through the curtains, casting a golden glow across Adrian's bedroom. She turned over, expecting to feel his warmth beside her. But the bed was empty. Frowning, she reached for her phone. Unknown number. Check the news. Her heart pounded. Claire, with shaking hands, she opened a news site, and what she saw made her blood run cold. Breaking news. Millionaire doctor Adrian Black caught in a secret relationship with his ex-fiancée. Below the headline was a picture of Adrian and Claire together. They were outside a fancy restaurant. Claire's hand was on his chest. She was smiling up at him. And Adrian, his expression was unreadable. Emma's heart shattered. No, this can't be true. Her mind screamed at her to trust him, but her heart was breaking apart. Claire's message flashed in her head. Adrian is mine. He always has been. A sob caught in her throat. She wanted to believe Adrian. She wanted to trust him. But the image was right there, mocking her. She flung the phone away and buried her face in her hands. Was she a fool to think this love was real? The confrontation. Emma was sitting on the couch, knees hugged to her chest, when Adrian walked in. He froze when he saw her red, puffy eyes. Emma, he said, immediately concerned. What's wrong? She lifted her phone, showing him the article. Tell me this isn't real, she whispered. Adrian's face darkened as he grabbed the phone. He cursed under his breath. Emma, this is a setup. She let out a shaky breath. Then explain. Adrian ran a frustrated hand through his hair. Claire cornered me yesterday. She said she wanted to talk. I only agreed because I wanted to end things for good. But I swear to you, I never touched her like that. She planned this. Emma wanted to believe him, but the doubts clawed at her. You should have told me, she said, her voice cracking. Adrian stepped closer, his dark eyes full of emotion. I was going to, but I was afraid. His voice dropped. Afraid you'd think exactly what you're thinking right now. She bit her lip, her vision blurred with tears. Emma, look at me, he begged. She hesitated, then met his gaze. There was no guilt in his eyes, no hesitation, only raw, desperate love. Her heart clenched painfully. "I love you," Adrian whispered, "and I will never betray you. Claire can try to destroy us, but she will fail, because I won't let her. I won't let you go." Emma's breath hitched. The past, the pain, the doubts, they didn't matter anymore, because the only truth she cared about was right in front of her. She stepped forward and threw her arms around his neck, holding him as tightly as she could. Adrian exhaled sharply, wrapping his arms around her, as if he'd never let go. And in that moment, Emma knew. She had found her home. She had found her forever. The final twist later that night. As Emma lay in Adrian's arms, her phone vibrated again. Unknown number. "You made the wrong choice." Her stomach twisted. Claire wasn't done, and Emma had a feeling the real battle was just beginning. Emma sat up in bed, staring at her phone, her fingers trembling. The message from Claire burned into her mind. "You made the wrong choice." A chill ran down her spine. She turned to Adrian, who was asleep beside her, his arm draped protectively over her waist. For the first time in weeks, she had felt safe. But Claire wasn't going to let them be happy. Emma's heart pounded as she realized something. Claire had failed to break them apart with lies, which meant she would try something worse. Taking a deep breath, Emma whispered, "Adrian." He stirred, blinking awake. His voice was husky, his eyes still heavy with sleep. Emma bit her lip. "Claire messaged me again." At that, Adrian was fully awake. His muscles tensed, and he sat up, his jaw clenched. "What did she say?" Emma handed him her phone. He read the message, his eyes darkening. "She's trying to scare you," he muttered. "She's losing control, so she's getting desperate." Emma hesitated. What if she does something dangerous? Adrian exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "She won't," he said, his voice firm. "Because I won't let her." His confidence should have reassured her, but deep inside, Emma knew Claire wasn't done, and her next move would be the most dangerous yet. The unexpected meeting. The next day, Adrian received an unexpected call from his hospital's board of directors. He had been summoned for an urgent meeting. Emma insisted on coming with him. She had a terrible feeling in her gut, and she was right. As soon as they stepped into the boardroom, they saw her, Claire, sitting across from the directors, a smug smile on her lips. Emma's stomach dropped. The chairman of the board, an older man with sharp eyes, folded his hands. "Dr. Black, we have a situation," he said, glancing between Adrian and Claire. "A serious accusation has been made against you." Emma's breath caught. Adrian's jaw tightened. "What accusation?" Claire let out a dramatic sigh and pulled out a file. "A patient has come forward," she said sweetly, "claiming that you took advantage of them." Emma's world stopped. Adrian froze beside her. Then he let out a harsh laugh. "This is ridiculous. I would never." Claire tilted her head, feigning innocence. "Then why is there proof?" She slid a folder across the table. Adrian picked it up and flipped through the contents, and his entire body went rigid. Emma peered over his shoulder, and what she saw made her sick. Photos, documents, fake messages between Adrian and a supposed patient. It was all fabricated, but to someone who didn't know the truth, it looked real. Emma gasped. "This is a setup." Claire sighed. "Is it?" She turned to the board. "You see, I know Adrian well. He's charming, but he's also reckless. If he's having an affair with his own patient, imagine how damaging that would be for the hospital." The chairman frowned. "Dr. Black, we take these allegations very seriously." Adrian's knuckles turned white as he clenched the folder. Emma could feel his rage, but he took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "This is a lie," he said firmly, "and I will prove it." Claire smirked. "Oh, I'm counting on that," she whispered. Emma's blood boiled. This wasn't just an attack on Adrian's reputation, it was a trap, and they had to find a way out before it was too late. A dangerous plan. That night, Emma sat with Adrian in his study. going through every piece of Claire's so-called evidence. She watched as Adrian rubbed his temples, exhaustion in his eyes. "She's good," he muttered. "She covered every detail. If I didn't know better, even I would think this was real." Emma frowned. "There has to be a mistake somewhere," she said. She flipped through the documents again, until something caught her eye. A timestamp. Emma gasped. "Adrian, look at this." He leaned in as she pointed to the supposed text messages between him and the patient. "These texts were sent at 7 p.m. on Tuesday night," she said. Adrian blinked. Then his eyes widened. "That's impossible," he murmured. "I was at the charity gala that night, in front of hundreds of people." Emma's pulse raced. They had proof. Claire had forged the messages, but she had made a mistake. Adrian wasn't even with the patient that day. Emma grabbed his hand, her eyes blazing with determination. "We can fight this," she whispered. Adrian looked at her, and for the first time that night, he smiled. A slow, confident smile. "You're right," he said, "and I know exactly how to bring Claire down." The final confrontation. The next morning, Adrian called for a second meeting with the board. Claire arrived, looking smug, but that smugness didn't last, because Adrian came prepared. He played the security footage from the charity gala, showing that he had been there the entire night. He showed real medical records, proving he hadn't seen the patient in question for over 6 months. And finally he revealed something no one expected. A recording. Claire's voice filled the room. "I will ruin him. I don't care what it takes." Gasps echoed around the table. The chairman's face darkened. "Miss Hayes, is this your voice?" Claire's face turned pale. For the first time, she had no answer. And just like that, she lost. The happy ending later that night. Emma and Adrian stood on the rooftop of his penthouse, looking over the city. The nightmare was over. Claire was gone. Adrian's name was cleared. And for the first time in weeks, Emma could finally breathe. Adrian turned to her, taking her hands in his. "I don't deserve you," he whispered. Emma smiled. "That's not true." He cupped her face. "I love you, Emma," he murmured, "and I will spend the rest of my life proving it." Tears welled in her eyes, and as Adrian leaned in, pressing the softest, most heartfelt kiss to her lips, she knew she had found the love of her life, forever.